They ruled like kings, worshipped like Brahmins, but their DNA belongs to the hills. No one questions the surface story. The Meitei of Manipur are the majority, the monarchs of the Imphal Valley, guardians of Vaishnavite temples, writers of ancient royal chronicles, heirs to a kingdom ruled by 78 kings, beginning with Pakangba in 33 CE. They built palaces from memory and myths. They speak the language of Sanskrit prayers. And they were once called by the British civilized, dominant, advanced. But something buried, deeper than any manuscript, says otherwise. A series of genetic studies from 2009 to 2020 using autosomal STRs, mtDNA RFLP, and ALU insertion polymorphisms uncovered a revelation most never expected. The Meiteis do not genetically group with Indo-Aryan castes from mainland India. They don't fully align with South Indian Dravidians either. Instead, their closest genetic relatives are from the Kuki-Chin, Tangkhul Naga, and Rongmei tribes. And beyond that, they match Han Chinese, Nuers from Nepal, and Tibeto-Burman speakers across Southeast Asia. One study concluded with unsettling clarity. The Meitei show an intermediate genetic structure, the average of all surrounding tribes. That same study recorded the Meitei's heterozygosity at 0.366, the highest among all Manipuri ethnic groups, a signal of extensive admixture from tribal, East Asian, and even Proto-Australoid elements. Still, in today's legal system, the Meitei are denied scheduled tribe status. Opponents argue they've outgrown tribal roots. They are too urban, too Hindu, too political. But genes don't care about politics, and bones don't forget what kingdoms try to bury. Archaeology adds another layer. In the caves of Kangkui and Tharan, Paleolithic tools over 30,000 years old hint at Australoid-Mongoloid settlers predating Meitei royalty. Neolithic migration from the Yunnan-Tibet corridor around 2000 BCE aligns perfectly with the Meitei's genetic map, pointing not toward India, but deeper into East and Southeast Asia. So here's the contradiction no one wants to answer. If the Meitei are royal, refined, and separate from the tribes, why does their DNA still echo the forest, the mountains, the ancestors of the hills? To find the truth, we must peel back the names, the gods, the kingdoms, and expose what lies beneath the crown. Because before there was a crown, there were clans, and the Meitei identity, the one now seen as royal, refined, high-born, didn't begin with a throne. It began with 7 fragments, ancient tribal confederacies that came together, not under God, but under war, diplomacy, and something even deeper, survival. The Chitharol Kumbaba, Manipur's royal chronicle, and the sacred Puyas, texts part myth, part memory, record the formation of a confederacy long before the valley ever knew Hinduism. 7. Salai, Ot's clan families undermerged, Angom, Kuman, Luang, Moirang, Khanganba, Sarang Lai Sangthem, and the one that would eventually rise above all, the Ning Thoja. It is this Ning Thoja clan in 33 CE that gave birth to King Pakangba, a semi-divine warrior king said to be born of serpent and sky, who began absorbing rival clans one by one, not just by conquest, but by intermarriage, ritual alliances, and sacred warfare. In just a few generations, the fragmented tribal mosaic was being shaped into a proto-state, the beginnings of the Kanglai Pak kingdom. But what most people miss is this. Each of those 7 clans had distinct dialects, gods, and funerary customs. The Kuman buried their dead in caves, just like the Kuki-Chin tribes. The Moirang had serpent worship traditions, almost identical to Tangkul Naga beliefs. Even the sacred coronation robes used by Meitei kings bear textile patterns traced to Tangkul Naga rituals. And this isn't fantasy. This is backed by field anthropology. Scholars like Gangmumei Kabui and colonial records from W. McCulloch, 1859, confirmed that many early Meitei clans were hill tribes absorbed into a valley polity. What we call royalty today was once just ritualized tribal leadership. Even the ancient Kangla fort, the seat of Meitei power, features architectural motifs, horned dragon roofs, raised clan halls, and ancestor pillars, found more commonly in Zeliangrong and Kuki sacred architecture. So the question is not how the Meitei became royal, it's how tribes became Meitei. Because when you strip away the Sanskrit chants and courtly language, what's left is not a monarchy that erased tribal identity, but a monarchy built from it. But who were the clans before they became kings? They became kings by standing on dry land. But what if that land was never dry to begin with? The Meitei kingdom wasn't built on earth. It was built on a vanished lake. It's not just myth. It's not just metaphor. Multiple British-era reports, including those by W. McCulloch, 1859, and T.C. Hudson, 1908, documented a strange local belief. That the entire Imphal Valley was once submerged underwater. A vast inland lake. Not a metaphor for spirituality. A real geographical lake, with ancient settlers living only in the surrounding hills. So what happened? The valley eventually dried due to tectonic shifts or gradual hydrological changes, as noted by early geological studies from the Survey of India, late 19th century. And once it drained, something extraordinary began. Hill tribes moved down. The descendants of forest spirits and mountain clans entered the empty lakebed and built kingdoms. They didn't originate in the valley. They returned to it. But here's the part that rewrites everything. Those same British records stated, "The customs, dialects and bloodlines of the Meitei show no significant break from those of the hill tribes, and yet, today, the Meitei are seen as separate." Now add this. In 1904, linguistic giant G.A. Grierson analysed Meitei and linked it to the Tibeto-Burman branch with roots in the Yunnan Plateau, the same migration corridor that gave rise to Kukichin and Tangkul Naga languages. Modern genetic studies, like the 2010 STR and mtDNA RFLP surveys, confirmed this. The Meitei don't just resemble East Asians, they carry haplogroups A, M and D star in high frequency. These are the same maternal lineages found in Han Chinese, Nuers of Nepal, and tribes of Upper Myanmar. And while this is happening in science, something older was already saying it. The Machel origin myth, shared by Meitei, Naga, and Kuki tribes, says they were once 3 brothers, born of one mother. They feasted together, then parted ways. One became Meitei, one became Kuki, one became Naga. They didn't separate because of war. They separated because the world changed. But somewhere along the way, the brother in the valley began to believe he was born different. So if the valley was a lake, and the kings were once migrants, what else has been erased from the map, and from memory? Maybe a ceremony, not a war, not a coronation, but something far older, a forgotten ritual, where no one ruled and no one bowed. A time when hill tribes and valley dwellers met under the same sky, laid their weapons at the earth, and offered their harvest to one another, not as strangers, but as kin. A forgotten harvest rite, where the hills bowed to the valley, and the valley shared its throne. They called it Merahu Chongba, a sacred festival held once a year, where the chiefs of the hills descended into the valley, not to raid, not to bargain, but to celebrate. They brought rice, forest game, fermented drinks, and in return the Meitei kings opened their gates. They danced together, ate together, gave thanks together to shared ancestors, shared soil, and one divine lineage. But then came the shift. Hinduization under King Garib Noaz in the early 18th century didn't just change gods, it changed memory. Old gods were renamed. Burial rites replaced with cremation, ancestral offerings labelled primitive. And slowly the shared ceremonies between hill and valley disappeared. Even Lai Haroba, the great Meitei festival of ancestral spirits, was rebranded under Vaishnavite ideals. But one line, one song, still survived. It says, "Settlers of the hills or of the valley, both are of the same stock." That lyric wasn't composed in Sanskrit. It was remembered in rhythm, in dance, in ritual breath, passed on through Mibis, the priestesses of the old religion, carried like a secret. And here's the twist. The Merahu Chongba has returned. Not as a tourist event, not as nostalgia, but as a spiritual revolt, a modern revival, where hill tribes again enter the valley wearing feathers, carrying drums, and this time reclaiming memory. They don't come asking to be remembered, they come to remind. But what if the bloodline remembers what the priests forgot? Turns out it does, because the stories written in bone, in blood, they're not always the ones that make it into books. They don't follow kings. They don't serve temples. They follow the mothers. They trace the fathers, and they remember the hills, even when the history says otherwise. The caste says they're high-born. The genes say they're cousins of the tribes. Let's start with the hard data. In 2010, a detailed analysis of 20 autosomal STR markers showed the Meitei to have the highest heterozygosity score in the region, 0.366. In plain words, it means their blood holds multiple origins, a rich admixture of ancestral threads. Now add the ALU insertion polymorphism study, published in PubMed 2010, comparing Meitei with 5 tribal and 3 non-tribal groups in Manipur. The result? Meitei stood genetically closer to tribal populations, particularly the Thadu, Kuki, and the Rongmei, Naga, than to South Indian castes or mainland Brahmin communities. Then came the RFLP and mtDNA haplogroup studies. Markers like A, C, D, and M subtypes, common in Han Chinese, Nuers, and Tibeto-Burman speakers, appeared in high frequencies among Meiteis, especially haplogroup M star, which is rare in Indo-European lineages but dominant in East and Southeast Asia. Even more revealing, no significant presence of Indo-Aryan maternal haplogroups, meaning the Meitei mother line does not descend from India's caste-based north. It flows through the northeast corridors, from Tibet, Yunnan, and possibly even southern China. And yet, their official classification remains non-tribal. They're told they're above, their rituals were erased, their indigenous script was burned, their funerals were reshaped, their tongue reshuffled with Sanskrit. But DNA doesn't burn, it doesn't bend to policy, it only reveals. And what it reveals is this, that the Meitei, despite temples and thrones, carry the blood of the very tribes they're now told they're not part of. Not in theory, not in metaphor, but in their chromosomes. But if their genes match the hills, who changed the map? The answer is more dangerous than silence. Because maps don't just record where people live, they shape who people become. And in the Meitei kingdom, identity wasn't inherited, it was assigned. You didn't have to be Meitei by birth, you just had to be named one. And that's how the transformation began. It wasn't invasion, it wasn't religion, it was statecraft. A slow, calculated reshaping of who belonged and who didn't. Throughout the medieval period, the Ningthouja dynasty absorbed more than just territory. They absorbed people, tribes, refugees, Brahmins from Bengal, Muslims from Sylhet, and each one, once accepted, was given a Sage, a clan surname. Not from blood, but from strategy. This process had a name. They called it Meitei. It wasn't forced, it was seductive, a pathway to power, to land, language and legacy. The adopted were written into Mehu roll, detailed genealogical scrolls, kept in every family. They look ancient, they feel authentic. But many were rewritten, retrofitted to create a continuous Meitei lineage, even when the real story had fractured origins in tribal hills and outsider lands. And the twist. The tribes adopted this too. The Kuki, the Tangkul, the Rongmei, many began keeping similar scrolls. Not to mimic royalty, but to record their vanishing roots, before someone else renamed them. Meanwhile, intermarriage between valley and hills was common. Before borders, before legal walls, hill daughters became queens, valley sons became warriors in tribal lands, even the coronation robes of Meitei kings. They were embroidered using Tangkul Naga textile motifs, the throne itself dressed in tribal patterns. But while names shifted, rituals remained. In the shadows of the temples, ancestor stones still stood. Forest spirits were still whispered to at night, even when the morning brought chants to Krishna. But there was one moment, one king, who tried to cut the thread. But one king would draw a line so deep, it burned the past. And it wasn't a metaphor, it was fire. What if the ancestors never vanished, but were burned out of memory? It happened on a single night in the early 18th century, under the rule of King Pamheba, later known as Garib Niwaz, the warrior king who converted to Vaishnavism. The year was 1729. He had once prayed to Sanamahi, Pakangba, and the ancestral spirits of the forest, but now he bowed to Krishna, and what followed was the Puya Methaba, the burning of the sacred Meitei texts. By royal command, centuries of ancestral knowledge were piled into heaps and set alight. These weren't just books, they were memory. They carried origin myths, clan histories, medicinal systems, tribal deities, all encoded in Meitei Mayek, the indigenous script. And that script, it too was erased. Replaced by Bengali, imported from the plains, what followed wasn't just fire, it was ritual overhaul. Burials were banned, cremation was imposed. The serpent gods, protectors of the clans, were declared demons. Even children's names were changed. The forest chants were replaced with Sanskrit hymns. But resistance left marks. Some puyas were hidden, smuggled in bamboo tubes, wrapped in cloth, whispered through generations. Were they original? Or forgeries of faith? Maybe both, but they were enough to ignite memory again. In modern revivals, old scrolls have resurfaced. One fragment mentions a queen who mourned the burning, hiding verses inside temple walls. Another recalls how priests in the hills refused to switch their funeral. Rites, even under threat. Because not every transformation is permanent, and not all truth can be erased by decree. The Meitei Mayek script, thought extinct, began reappearing in underground schools, tattoos carved into walking sticks, as if the bones themselves remembered the shapes. Because identity is more than paper, more than prayer, more than power. But even fire can't burn what's encoded in bone. Because sometimes what survives isn't written on scrolls. It's whispered between teeth, pressed into syllables, hidden. In the way we speak, languages don't lie, even when history is rewritten. The Meitei tongue, Meiteilon, as it's called, was never born in palaces or temples. Its rhythm didn't come from Sanskrit verses or courtly chants. Its deep structure, the very bones of its grammar, are Tibeto-Burman. And in 1904, British linguist George A. Grissom saw it clearly. He placed Meitei within the Kuki-Chin linguistic group, right alongside the languages of the very people Meiteis were taught to distance themselves from. And here's the twist most never hear. The oldest layers of Meitei share blood with Tangkhul, Thadao, and even Zeliangrong. Not just in loose words, but in the most intimate places. The word for mother, the word for hill, the word for death. Dr. W. Ibohal Singh, a leading Manipuri linguist, argued that modern Meitei is an offshoot of Kuki-Chin dialects, not a pure branch, but a grafted one grown from tribal soil. The Sanskritization of Meitei, that only began in the 18th century, during the reign of King Garib Niwaz, right when the Puyas burned and Bengali script was imposed. But language resists conquest. While hymns changed, prayers changed, even family names changed, deep in the tongue, the syntax of the ancestors survived. Linguists call it substrate memory, the hidden layer of a conquered language that won't die. Like how Latin never fully erased Gaulish in France, or how Persian still echoes in modern Urdu. And if the very grammar of Meitei carries tribal echoes, if every sentence still holds fragments of hills, forest, and migration, then how long can anyone pretend the tongue doesn't remember? Because memory isn't just stored in words or written on paper. Sometimes it curls around the roots of belief, scales glistening, eyes wide, waiting. In both valley and hill, a serpent slithers through shrines. Pakangba, the coiled serpent god of the Meiteis, rules over the underworld, the water and transformation. But look closely. The same serpent curls through Naga and Kuki cosmology, guardians of ancestral gates, spirits of the land, watchers of the dead. This isn't coincidence, it's convergence, or maybe origin. The earliest form of Sanamahism, the pre-Hindu Meitei religion, isn't built on idols. It's built on whispers to trees, on offerings to water, on Umang Lai, sacred, forest deities who live in groves and streams. That's not a royal religion. That's not a Sanskritic tradition. That is animism, the raw, undiluted belief system of tribal societies. And when anthropologist T.C. Hodson documented Manipuri customs in 1908, he noted how Sanamahism mirrored tribal spiritual structures across Chin, Zomi, and Kuki peoples, from the belief in guardian spirits to taboos tied to specific trees. Even the Sangai festival, celebrated today as a tourism showcase, it's a ritual born from hill tribe lore. The dance of the deer is a dance of respect for the sacred animal, a spirit being in both Meitei and tribal oral traditions. And the Mera Ho Chongba, the festival of unity? It was never a political performance. It was a ritual reminder that valley and hill are children of the same myth. Sanamahi, Umanglai, Koiru Lema. Their names may differ across dialects, but their faces, their forests, their function are reflections. Their gods never divided them. Only their rulers did. But now, it's not the gods, the kings or the priests who divide. It's the law. It's a card. And that card holds the power to reshape history. What happens when heritage becomes a weapon? The Meitei, royal in status, Sanskritized in rituals, centralized in power, have filed to be officially recognized as a scheduled tribe. A status meant to protect indigenous peoples, once labelled primitive by colonizers, now rebranded as politically disadvantaged. The protests were immediate. Accusations flew. They're too dominant. They're too Hinduized. They don't look like us anymore. But colonial records tell a different story. In 1859, political agent Major W. McCulloch wrote that the Meitei shared manners, customs and habits with the hill tribes, differing only in language and religion. In 1908, anthropologist T.C. Hodson flatly classified them as non-Aryan hill people, linguistically and ethnologically Tibeto-Burman. Flash forward a century, genetic studies between 2010 and 2019 confirm it. Y chromosome and mitochondrial data place Meitei closer to Kuki, Rongmei, Tangkhul and even Han Chinese groups, not the Indo-Aryan populations of the Indian mainland. But this isn't just genetics, it's identity under fire. Because if Meitei become ST, what happens to the others already holding that card? Would land rights shift? Would reservations be restructured? Would bloodlines be redrawn by bureaucrats? The irony is brutal. The descendants of the 7 clans who once absorbed tribe after tribe are now petitioning to be counted among them. And somewhere in this legal storm, ancient songs still echo. The hills and the valley are of the same stock. But what happens when your reflection is labelled your enemy? The fire of modern politics may burn in courtrooms and headlines, but beneath the ashes, something ancient is still alive. A stone, a tree, a serpent, and a myth so old it doesn't care who holds the tribe card. The Meitei, the Naga, the Kuki, 3 brothers, 1 feast. Then they walked 3 paths. This is the story whispered in Makal, a sacred village in Senapati district, where locals say the ancestors once lived as one. The tale is almost too perfect. 3 brothers, born of the same motherland, share a final meal beneath a banyan tree, and part ways. One becomes Meitei, master of the valley. One becomes Kuki, keeper of the southern hills. One becomes Naga, guardian of the north. But Makal isn't just a legend, it's geography. It's memory in stone, the departure stone, the dividing tree, the ancestral altar, all still stand. And now something wild is stirring again. There are plans, ambitious ones, to build a reunited heritage park at Makal. A place not just to remember, but to reconcile. Because even the songs remember. Meitei hymns, ancient and sacred, still speak of shared blood, of gods that crossed valleys, of rites once danced together. It's not about tribal status anymore. It's about returning to a chapter that was never finished. Because what if identity was never meant to be walls, but roots? A serpent carved into a temple wall. A ritual mask passed from one clan to another. A story told by 3 nations, all whispering the same name. So, if identity is a story we tell, what if it's time we remember the first chapter